December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest, on a frozen, unnamed track somewhere between St. Vith and Bastogne. The cold is not just a temperature, it is a physical enemy. It is a presence that lives inside the wool of the uniform, inside the steel of the rifle, inside the lungs. It is 48 hours into the greatest gamble of the Third Reich, the offensive that will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. And for Private First Class Miller, a runner for the 101st Airborne, the cold is the least of his problems. He is gripping the wheel of a Willys Jeep, fighting the ice ruts. The canvas top and doors are useless against the wind. His knuckles are white, not from grip, but from frost. Beside him, his corporal is slumped, half-conscious, holding a bloody field dressing to his side. They are carrying the new radio codes for an artillery battery that has lost communication. Without these codes, the guns are blind. Without the guns, the line breaks. The Jeep is their only hope. It is the miracle machine, the symbol of American industrial might. The little 4x4 that can go anywhere, do anything. Miller is praying to it, pleading with it. The narrow track is a nightmare of frozen mud, littered with the debris of a retreating supply column. And then, it happens. It is not the crack of a German 88. It is not the rattle of an MG42. It is a sound far more terrifying. First, a slight change in the engine's rhythm. A subtle, metallic tap-tap-tap that grows in the space of 3 seconds into a high-pitched, grinding shriek. It is the sound of metal eating itself. Miller stomps the clutch, throwing the gear stick into neutral, but it is too late. A cloud of blue-white smoke erupts from under the hood, so thick it blinds him. The engine seizes, the fan belt gives a final squeal, and the entire vehicle locks up, sliding to a dead. Silent stop, silence, the awful, profound silence of the snow-covered forest. The corporal looks at him, his eyes wide with a dull panic. "What was that?" Miller says nothing. He knows exactly what it was. He grabs his rifle, jumps out into the knee-deep snow, and fumbles with the frozen latches on the hood. He heaves it open. The sight is a catastrophe. The smell is worse, a toxic perfume of burned oil and superheated steel. The entire right side of the Go Devil engine is glistening black. Oil, it is everywhere. Puddled in the frame, dripping onto the snow, coating the axle. He knows, even before he looks, what he will find. He shoves his hand into the greasy hot darkness of the engine block, and he finds it. A single, hollow bolt. The oil filter canister, the entire assembly, is gone. It has simply vanished. Vibrated loose, stripped its threads, and fallen off somewhere on the ice, miles back. The engine's oil pump, doing its job exactly as designed, had dutifully pumped every last drop of the engine's lifeblood out of that hollow bolt and onto the frozen mud of Belgium. The engine, starved of lubrication, had torn itself to pieces in less than a minute. The Jeep is not a vehicle. It is a 3,000-pound paperweight. Miller stares at the ruined, smoking metal. The corporal cocks his pistol, his hand shaking. He has heard it too. In the distance, the unmistakable clank-clank-clank of heavy armor. A Panzer, this is the nightmare. This is the weapon that is slaughtering American soldiers by the thousand, a weapon no one in the press will ever report on. It is not a Tiger tank. It is not a secret V2 rocket. It is a faulty 10-cent gasket and a piece of badly designed pressed tin garbage. The official doctrine says to check it, to maintain it, to replace it. But the doctrine is a suicide pact. The official part is a killer. And on this frozen road, 2 more Americans are about to die, not from enemy action, but from a catastrophic mechanical failure. This is not the story of the Jeep, you know. This is not the story of the triumphant machine that won the war. This is the story of its one fatal flaw, a flaw so profound it threatened to stop the entire Allied invasion in its tracks. And it is the story of how that flaw was defeated, not by a general in a war room, not by an engineer in Detroit, but by an army of nameless, greasy-handed mechanics who saw the problem, who were ignored by the system, and who finally took matters into their own hands. This is the story of how an illegal, unauthorized fix, a blatant violation of official military doctrine, kept the American army alive. To understand the betrayal, you must first understand the love affair. The Jeep was not just a vehicle. It was the spine of the entire Allied war effort. In 1940, The US Army knew it was being dragged into a new kind of war. A war of speed, of lightning movement, of blitzkrieg. The old world of horses and trenches was dead. The new world belonged to the machine. The Army put out a desperate, impossible request to 135 companies. They needed a light, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle. They needed it to be powerful, unstoppable, and light enough to be lifted by 4 men. And they needed a working prototype in 49 days. Only one tiny, bankrupt company, American Bantam, delivered. Their design was a masterpiece. A miracle of engineering. Willys, Overland, and Ford soon piled in, refining the design, adding the powerful Go Devil engine. The result was the Willys MB, the Jeep, and it changed everything. It was the most versatile tool of the war. It was a command car for generals. It was a scout car for reconnaissance. It was an ambulance for medics. It towed anti-tank guns. It carried ammunition to the front line and plasma to the aid stations. It was a machine gun nest. It was a tractor. GIs used it to plow fields, to power generators, to run movie projectors. The entire Allied doctrine of mechanized warfare, the very thing that allowed Patton to race across France, was built on the back of over 600,000 of these little metal workhorses. The Army ran on the Jeep, and the Jeep ran on oil, and that was the problem. The Go Devil engine was a marvel, but it needed to be kept clean. In the dust of North Africa, in the mud of Italy, dirt could destroy an engine. So the designers in Toledo, Ohio, had included a state-of-the-art feature: a replaceable oil filter. It was a small tin canister mounted on the side of the engine block. Inside was a filter element. Oil was pumped from the engine, forced through this filter, and then returned clean to the crankcase. The canister itself was held onto the engine by a single, long bolt that ran through its center. A cork or fiber gasket at the top was supposed to create a high-pressure seal. It was a brilliant idea, on paper. In the real world, it was a disaster. It was a design flaw of catastrophic proportions. The engineers had designed a part for a civilian highway, not a war zone. The constant, brutal vibration of the engine, the bone-jarring pounding of shell-cratered roads, the extreme cold of a European winter, the intense heat of a desert summer. The part simply could not take it. The cheap, wartime-quality gaskets would either crack from the cold or disintegrate from the heat and vibration. The canister itself, made of thin-pressed tin, would warp. The single retaining bolt would strip its threads or simply vibrate loose, and when it failed, it did not leak. It gushed. It was a gusher. The engine's oil pump, running at full pressure, would empty the entire crankcase, all 4 quarts of oil, onto the ground in under a minute. The oil pressure light on the dashboard, if it even worked, would only light up in the last few seconds. By then it was an obituary. The engine's bearings, starved of lubrication, would melt. The pistons would weld themselves to the cylinder walls. The engine would seize, catastrophically and permanently. It was called throwing a rod, and it was a death sentence. The reports flooded in from every front. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Jeeps were dying everywhere. Engines were seizing in the middle of firefights. Convoys were grinding to a halt. The logistics chain, the great American advantage, was breaking. The Red Bull Express, the lifeline of the race across France, was being bled dry, one dead Jeep at a time. The Army was immobilized by its own miracle machine. This was the strategic problem. The institutional arrogance was the response. The Ordnance Department, the massive bureaucracy responsible for supply, saw the reports. They knew they had a crisis. But they could not, or would not, admit the flaw was in the design. To do so would mean admitting their 600,000 vehicle fleet was defective. It would mean a recall, a redesign, a massive, impossible retooling in the middle of the war. So they did what all bureaucracies do. They blamed the user, they issued memos. Technical bulletins were sent to every motor pool from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. They claimed that GIs, the mechanics, were over-tightening the center bolt, warping the canister. They said they were using the wrong gaskets. They said they were not following proper maintenance intervals. Their solution was not to fix the part. Their solution was to send more parts. They flooded the supply chain with millions of replacement gaskets, millions of replacement filter elements, Tens of thousands of brand-new crated engines. They were trying to solve a fundamental design flaw with a mountain of paperwork and spare parts. The official doctrine was firm. The filter must be used. It must be maintained. It must be replaced according to the manual, to the exhausted 19-year-old mechanic in a frozen field in Belgium, in trying to keep a company's Jeeps alive with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. This memo was a death sentence. He was being ordered by a general 1,000 miles away to keep installing the very part that was killing his friends. The system was the enemy. The manual was a lie. And the real war was between the men who drove the Jeeps and the men who designed them. This hero had no name. He had thousands of names. He was a T4, a technician 4th grade, in a motor pool behind the lines in Normandy. He was a farm boy from Ohio who had spent his life fixing tractors. He was a 20-year-old from Brooklyn who had worked in his uncle's auto garage. He was Mac, or Smitty, or Chief. He was covered in black knuckle-deep grease. He was exhausted. He had not slept in 3 days. And he was the most important man in the American Army. His war was not fought with a rifle. It was fought with a wrench, a blowtorch, and a bottomless well of cynicism. He was the man at the bottom of the logistical chain, the one who had to turn the memos from headquarters into running machines. And he was staring at a graveyard. In his small, muddy patch of captured French orchard, he had a line of 20 Jeeps. 6 of them were dead. Not hit by mortars, not strafed. They were dead from seized engines. He had just finished reading the latest technical bulletin, T.S.B. 21F4, delivered by a fresh-faced lieutenant who had never held a wrench. The bulletin told him he was doing his job wrong. It told him he was over-tightening the bolts. It came with a diagram. Mac crumpled the memo and threw it into the mud. He was holding the problem in his hand. It was a brand-new cork and fiber gasket, pulled from a sealed box. It was hard, brittle, and cracked. It was garbage. He looked at the dead engine he had just pulled from a scout car. The bearings were fused, a solid mass of melted metal. He looked at the empty, gaping hole on the side of the block where the filter canister used to be. This was his eureka moment. It was not a flash of genius. It was a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. The men in Detroit, the engineers, the experts at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, they were all wrong. They were trying to solve the problem of battlefield vibration with a piece of pressed tin and a gasket made of paper. They were telling him to replace a part that was designed to fail. He knew, with the certainty of a man who lives by the feel of metal, that as long as that canister was on the engine was a time bomb. He knew the manual. The manual was his Bible, and he was about to commit heresy. He went to his lieutenant. The lieutenant was a 22-year-old from a good college, and he believed in the system. Mac held up the broken gasket. He told the officer, flat out, that the filters were the problem. He said they needed to stop replacing them. The lieutenant was not impressed. He was cold. He was tired. He pointed a clean finger at the bulletin board. He said, "Sergeant, your job is not to redesign the Willys MB. Your job is to follow ordnance specifications. T.S.B. 21F4 clearly states the procedure. Follow it, or I will have you up on charges." He was dismissed, laughed at, ignored. He was a grease monkey, a grunt. What could he possibly know that a general in the Ordnance Corps did not? Mac walked back to his line of dead Jeeps. He looked at the replacement engines, sitting in their crates. He looked at the 2 dead Jeeps he had just fixed that morning, the ones that had seized 5 miles down the road with brand new, by-the-book filters installed. This was the catalyst. He was done. The system was insane, and it was getting his men killed. He was going to break the rules. He looked at the engine block. The problem was simple. Oil comes out of a high-pressure line from the pump. It goes into the filter. It comes out of the filter and goes back into the engine. He had an idea. An idea so simple, so stupid, and so profoundly illegal that it could only have been born in a muddy field. 5,000 miles from a single engineer. He was going to take the filter out of the equation. He grabbed his wrench. He unbolted the entire useless canister assembly. He threw the tin can and its retaining bolt onto the scrap heap. He was now left with two openings on the side of the engine block. The high-pressure out line and the low-pressure in line. If he started the engine now, it would bleed out in 30 seconds, just as if the filter had blown. He needed to connect them. He rummaged through his scrap pile. He found a small piece of copper tubing, maybe from a wrecked fuel line. He fired up his blowtorch. He heated the metal, bending it with his bare, gloved hands into a tight U-shape. He cut the ends, flared them. He scavenged two fittings. He created a simple, elegant 3-inch loop of copper pipe. A jumper. He threaded one end into the out port. He threaded the other end into the in port. He tightened them down hard. This was the invention. The unauthorized fix. He had just performed surgery. He had bypassed the filter. The engine's oil would now circulate, unfiltered, but it would circulate. It would stay inside the engine. This was the test. He primed the carburetor. He hit the ignition. The Go Devil engine roared to life. It sounded rough, but it was alive. Mac stood and watched. He let it run for 5 minutes, 10, 20. He revved it until the whole Jeep shook. He got in, slammed it into gear and did donuts in the mud, throwing dirt and ice everywhere. He drove it over a collapsed wall. He stopped. He got out. He popped the hood. The engine was hot. It was greasy. And it was dry. The little copper loop was holding. Not a single drop of oil was leaking. This was the it works moment. It was a profound, world-changing success. He had just created a Jeep that could not bleed out. But he was also a man in deep trouble. He had just, by the book, committed a major act of sabotage. The manual was explicit. The filter was essential. Running an engine on unfiltered oil was a cardinal sin. The dirt, the grit, the tiny particles of metal would act as a liquid abrasive, slowly grinding the bearings, the pistons, the camshafts into paste. The official doctrine said his fix would destroy the engine. Mac looked at the mud, at the snow, at the sound of artillery in the distance. He looked at the dead engine on the ground, the one that had lasted 30 seconds with a clean filter. He made a choice. The experts were worried about an engine lasting 20,000 miles. He was worried about it lasting the next 20 minutes. He was trading a long, slow theoretical death for a short, sudden guaranteed one. He was choosing survival. Dirty oil was infinitely, profoundly, and fundamentally better than no oil at all. He turned to his crew, the other grease-stained T4s. He pointed to the Jeep. He said, "Do that." To all of them. And don't tell the lieutenant. The invention was too good to stay secret. It couldn't. It was a virus of common sense. And it spread through the motor pools of the European theatre of operations with a speed that no official memo could ever match. It started in one muddy field in Normandy. A mechanic from another company, desperate, his own motor pool a junkyard of seized engines, came over to beg for a spare oil pump. He saw what Mac had done. He saw the row of running Jeeps, their engines humming, their sides coated in mud, but their engine blocks clean. He saw the simple, elegant copper loop. He did not ask questions. He did not ask about the manual. He just looked at it, nodded and said, "Where did you get the fittings?" Mac pointed to the scrap heap. The idea was carried from one unit to the next. It was whispered from one T4 to another, a piece of secret, greasy gospel. It was the great unauthorized fix. The mechanics, the men at the bottom, the men who actually had to make the war work, had found their own solution. They didn't care about long-term engine wear. They didn't care about warranties. They cared about one thing, getting that Jeep through the next patrol, the next supply run, the next battle. This was no longer a single mechanic's test. This was a grassroots rebellion, and the boardroom was not a high-ceilinged office in Berlin or Washington. The boardroom was every muddy field, every bombed-out barn, every forward maintenance depot where a by-the-book officer had to confront the greasy, insubordinate genius of his enlisted men. The conflict was inevitable. It came in the form of a man like Captain Wells. Wells was a good officer. He was Ordnance Corps, trained at Aberdeen. He believed in the system. He believed in specifications, in torque settings, in maintenance schedules. He believed that the manual was the only thing separating a professional army from an armed mob. His job was to inspect the motor pools of the 12th Army Group, to enforce compliance, to make sure the flood of replacement parts was being used correctly. He arrived at Mac's motor pool on a cold, wet morning, and he was at first impressed. The vehicle availability rate was over 90%. An impossible number. He saw Jeeps running that on paper should have been dead. He walked down the line, clipboard in hand, checking serial numbers. Then he stopped. He looked at an engine. He stared, confused. Something was missing. He looked closer, his eyes tracing the lines. He saw the bypass, the ugly, unauthorized field expedient piece of copper tubing. He straightened up. He called for the chief mechanic. Mac came over, wiping his hands on a rag. The captain's voice was cold. Colder than the wind. He pointed at the copper tube. "What is that?" Mac looked him in the eye. "That's the fix, sir, the fix." Wells's face flushed. He was a man who understood regulations. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This was not a fix. This was sabotage. This was a flagrant, willful violation of T.S.B. 21F4. This was the destruction of government property. He said, "Sergeant, you are running this engine without an oil filter," Mac said. "That's right, sir." Wells was incredulous. He was sputtering. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? The grit, the carbon, the metal particles. You are grinding this engine to dust. You are turning the oil into sandpaper. This is a court-martial offense." Mac held his gaze. He pointed to the line of running Jeeps. Then he pointed to the graveyard. The pile of dead engines in the corner, all of them with their official, by-the-book filters still attached. He said, "Sir, with all due respect. Your way, the engine lasts maybe a day, maybe an hour. My way, it lasts. It might not last 10,000 miles. But it'll last the next 10. And that's the only 10 that matter." This was the conflict. The man who read the book versus the man who fixed the machine. The expert versus the unexpert. Wells saw a man destroying a 20,000-mile engine. Mac saw a man building a 20-minute engine, one that would not fail his friends in a firefight. Wells was furious. He was trapped by his own logic. He opened his mouth to order the sergeant arrested. To order every single one of these illegal modifications ripped out. And at that exact moment, a new Jeep, a replacement, rattled into the compound. It was driven by a terrified-looking private. It was sputtering, trailing a faint wisp of blue smoke. The private reported to the captain. "Sir, I just picked this vehicle up from the main depot. It's brand new. Drove it 10 miles. She's making a funny noise." Mac and the captain looked at each other. A long, silent moment. Mac walked over to the new Jeep. He didn't even have to pop the hood. He just knelt and looked underneath. A steady drip, drip. Drip of black oil was falling onto the mud. The brand new, factory-installed, by-the-book gasket was already failing. Captain Wells looked at the new, dying Jeep. He looked at Mac's line of perfectly running, sabotaged Jeeps. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at the manual. He saw his entire world, his world of order and regulations, collapse in on itself. This was the gamble. This was the moment of the damn the rules decision. This captain, this by-the-book bureaucrat, was the desperate advocate. He had a choice. He could follow his orders. He could enforce the regulations. He could write up the sergeant, and in doing so, he would take this entire company off the line. He would ground their vehicles, sentencing them to death by paperwork, or he could not. He stood there for a full minute, the wind whipping his coat. The sound of the new Jeep's leaking oil was the only sound. He finally looked at Mac. He did not say, "You were right." He did not say, "Good job." He did not authorize the fix. He did something far more important. He tore the top sheet off his clipboard. He crumpled it in his fist. He pointed at the new, leaking Jeep. "Sergeant, this vehicle is non-operational." "Fix it," Mac nodded. "Yes, sir." The captain turned. He said, "I will be back in 2 weeks to inspect your motor pool. I expect to see a 90% operational readiness rate. I don't care how you do it, but if I find one vehicle that is seized up because of a blown oil filter, they will have your stripes." He did not look back. He got in his own Jeep, which, Mac noted, was already leaking, and drove away. The gamble was made. The system had officially, unofficially blinked. The boardroom conflict was over. The man on the ground had won. The advocate had made his choice. He had bet his career, not on the manual, but on the mechanic. The rebellion was now sanctioned. It was no longer a secret. It was the fix the news spread. The story of the captain who tore up his report. It emboldened other officers. It empowered other mechanics. It became an open secret, a mass collective decision to ignore the Ordnance Department for the sake of winning the war. The scrap heaps of Europe were picked clean of copper tubing, of old fuel lines, of anything that could be bent into that life-saving U-shape. Mechanics became artists, creating their bypasses out of nothing. It was a massive, unauthorized, illegal, and absolutely essential modification program, run by an army of T4s. The Ordnance Department was oblivious, or perhaps in a fit of self-preservation, chose to be. They continued to ship millions of useless gaskets to the front, and the mechanics continued to throw them in the trash, installing their own battle-proven fix instead. The system was in place. The American army, held together by an illegal piece of scrap copper, was now ready for its greatest test. It was ready for the Ardennes. It was ready for the Bulge, December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes. The German High Command has built the perfect trap. The operation is codenamed Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. It is a masterpiece of deception, a thunderclap of violence, a last, desperate, brilliant gamble. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Hasso von Manteuffel, the armored specialists, have unleashed over 400,000 men, spearheaded by the elite of the Reich, the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions. Their arrogance is absolute and it is justified. They have achieved total surprise. They are attacking the weakest, thinnest part of the American line, a ghost front held by green, untested troops and exhausted resting divisions. The German plan is not just to break the line. The plan is to move. It is a blitzkrieg, a race to the Meuse River and then to the ultimate prize, the port of Antwerp. Their entire strategy is built on a single core assumption, that the American army will be paralyzed. They are counting on the weather. The sky is a ceiling of impenetrable grey, grounding the all-powerful Allied Air Force. They are counting on the cold, a bitter Arctic snap that plunges the forests into a sub-zero nightmare. The German commanders know that this kind of cold kills machines. It freezes fuel lines. It turns lubricating oil into sludge. It cracks gaskets. They are convinced that the soft American army, with its dependence on its vehicles, will grind to a halt. They envision the roads to Bastogne and St. Vith clogged with thousands of abandoned, broken-down American trucks and jeeps, their engines seized, their crews fleeing. The perfect system of the German offensive is designed to strike a static, frozen, immobile enemy. The panzers advance. The King Tigers, the Panthers. They roll through the forward American positions like a harvester through wheat. The American line does not bend. It shatters, and then the plan begins to fail. The Germans are baffled. The roads are not clear. They are not littered with abandoned vehicles. They are instead choked with a moving, buzzing, furious swarm. The enemy is not static. The enemy is fluid. This is the climax. This is the validation of the illegal fix. The entire American doctrine of mobile warfare is being put to the ultimate test. And it is a test that, on paper, it should have failed, but it is not failing. Inside the surrounded, besieged town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne is cut off. They are the hole in the donut, but inside that hole the U.S. Army is not dying. It is moving, a medic's jeep, its canvas top removed, races across the town square, the place McAuliffe. The driver is 19, his face is black with frostbite. The engine under his hood has not been shut off in 72 hours. It is running hot, running rich, but it is running. In the back, 2 stretchers are strapped to the frame. He hits a shell crater, the vehicle launches into the air, and when it lands, the engine clanks, but it does not die. He makes it to the aid station, a bombed-out church, and 2 more men survive. He survives because the T4 mechanic in the 101st Motor Pool, a man who has not seen a new gasket in a month, has bypassed the oil filter on every jeep in the division. A platoon of tank destroyers is holding a crossroads, a place called Neuville. They are being hammered by Panthers. Their radios are screaming for ammunition. A quarter-ton jeep, towing a trailer loaded with 76mm anti-tank rounds, slides on the ice, fishtailing wildly, but it does not stop. The driver is hunched behind the wheel, the cold so intense it feels like a physical blow. The oil pressure gauge is flickering, but the oil is in the engine. It is dirty, it is gritty, but it is in. The Jeep makes it to the guns. The guns stay in the fight. The German advance is stalled for another precious 4 hours. This is the new tactic in action. The tactic is survival. The tactic is mobility. The tactic is the simple, profound fact of an engine that starts in 10 degrees below zero weather. The German commanders are confused. Their reports are filled with bafflement. The Americans are not behaving as they should. They are supposed to be road-bound. They are supposed to be brittle. Instead, they are moving off the roads. They are using the Jeep's Forks 4 to cut through the snow-choked forests, to set up flanking machine gun nests, to appear where no vehicle should be. The Germans are fighting ghosts. Ghosts in Jeeps whose engines do not die. And then comes the main event. 100 miles to the south. General George S. Patton. He has promised to relieve Bastogne. His staff says it is impossible. It is a 100-mile race in a blizzard, pivoting an entire army 90 degrees on roads that are solid ice. It is a logistical nightmare that should break any army. It is the single greatest test of the Willys Jeep and the illegal fix in the entire. When the order goes out to the motor pools, if the Third Army, get them running. Now, the mechanics! The anonymous heroes, the T4s, perform the miracle. They are not wasting time with by-the-book oil filter changes. They are not reading memos. They are working with blowtorches to thaw frozen fuel lines and batteries. They are pouring in whatever oil they can find, captured German oil, aviation oil, anything. And they are relying on the one thing they know works. The little copper loop, the bypass. The great sabotaged army roars to life. The columns of the Third Army, spearheaded by the 4th Armored Division, hit the frozen roads. It is a river of steel, and at the front, in the middle, and on the flanks are the Jeeps, thousands of them. They are the scouts. They are the command cars. They are the ambulances. They are the tractors towing the anti-tank guns, and they are not breaking down. The German system, the perfect arrogance of the offensive, is now in a panic. Their plan was a race against time. They had to reach the Meuse before Patton could react. They had failed. They had failed because their own complex, superior machines were freezing. The Panthers and Tigers, marvels of engineering, were too complex. Their oil turned to jelly. Their transmissions failed, but the cheap, simple, mass-produced, sabotaged American Jeep, it just kept running. The German advance stalls. They are out of fuel, their spearheads blunted, their momentum broken. They are stopped at Bastogne, held at St. Vith, and they can hear in the distance the growing, unmistakable sound of an entire American army advancing on their flank. The climax is the arrival of that army. The first tanks of the 4th Armored roll into Bastogne, but they were led there by the scouts in their Jeeps. The illegal oil fix has been proven decisively in the most brutal, high-stakes battle on the Western Front. The mechanics' unauthorized idea did not just save a few engines. It saved the 101st Airborne. It allowed Patton's army to move. It kept the American logistical spine from snapping. Millions of soldiers would survive the war, not because of a new tank, but because a T4 in the mud had the courage to defy a memo. And in doing so, kept the real weapon of the war, mobility, alive. The mechanic had faced the system, and he had won. When the war in Europe finally ended, the reckoning began! Not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the polished offices of the Ordnance Department in Detroit and at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The statisticians, the engineers, the men with the clipboards, had a profound, baffling mystery on their hands. They were analyzing the after-action reports, the maintenance logs, the failure rates. And the numbers made no sense. They had a chart. On one axis was the date, on the other was the rate of catastrophic engine failure for the Willys MB. The line held steady through 1942 and 1943. Then, as the invasion of France began, it spiked, just as expected. The mud, the dust, the intensity, it was all predictable. But then, in December 1944 and January 1945, at the exact moment, the reports described the most brutal cold, the most intense frontline combat, and the most hellish maintenance conditions. The failure rate plummeted. It did not just dip. It fell off a cliff. During the Battle of the Bulge, the moment when, by all engineering logic, the Jeep fleet should have disintegrated, it had somehow become more reliable. It was an impossibility. A statistical miracle. It was as if an army had run into a blizzard and had fewer cases of frostbite. They were baffled. They searched the memos. The only official change was the flood of new gaskets and bulletins, T.S.B 21F4. Their fix had been in place, but they knew, in their hearts, that paper gaskets could not have caused this. They requisitioned vehicles. They had whole Jeeps, battle-scarred and weary, shipped back from the 101st Airborne, from the 4th Armored, from every unit that had seen the worst of the Ardennes. They put them up on lifts. They tore the engines down and they found them, by the hundreds. Ugly, field-expedient, unauthorized illegal pieces of scrap copper and bent tubing. They found the bypasses. They saw the evidence of their own colossal failure. They saw in scorched metal that an army of anonymous, teenage mechanics had collectively, spontaneously, and in complete violation of orders, redesigned the most important vehicle of the war. They had done it on the fly, in the mud, with no blueprints, and they had saved the American army from its own supply chain. There was no emergency countermeasure. The war was over. There was just a quiet, horrifying bureaucratic silence. The reports were filed. The data was buried. The experts had been proven catastrophically wrong, and the system had been saved by the very unexperts it had threatened to court-martial. The system's reaction was to pretend it never happened. But what of the hero? He came home. He was T4 Mac, or Smitty. He was one of millions. He got his discharge papers at Fort Dix. He took a bus back to Iowa, or Pennsylvania, or Texas. He had a few medals he put in a drawer. He had nightmares about the cold and the sound of artillery, but he never, ever told anyone. He did not get a parade for what he did. He did not get a pension for his invention. He was not a hero. He was a mechanic. He went back to his quiet life. He used his GI Bill money, not to go to college, but to buy a small 2-bay garage on the edge of town. He got married. He put up a sign that just said, auto repair. His life, after the war, was a life of tinkering. It was a life of solving problems, not with a manual, but with his hands. He was the man the town trusted when their tractor died. When their new Chevrolet was making a sound they did not understand. He was the man who knew, by feel, what was wrong,